Hello everyone, I am Jaivi P. Gorpio, a fourth year Bachelor of Elementary Education student. Welcome to this pre-recorded lecture discussion in Philippine history. Today, we will be reviewing important aspects of Philippine history, a subject that help us understand our identity, struggles, and triumphs as a nation. From pre-colonial times to the present, the Philippines has undergone significant transformation influenced by colonization, revolutions, and modernization. And by understanding our history, we gain insights to the challenges of our ancestors faced and how their sacrifices shape our independence and democracy today. And as we go through this review, we will revisit the key historical events, influential figures, and important decisions that shape our nation. And I will present to you each question and followed by a clear and detailed explanation of the correct answer. Now let's begin with our first question. The first question: who was the first Governor General of the Philippines under the Spanish rule? The answer is letter A, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. Miguel Lopez de Legazpi was appointed the first Governor General of the Philippines in 1565, leading the Spanish colonization of the islands. Ferdinand Magellan, though the first European to arrive, but never governed the Philippines. Next, what was the main reason for the execution of Gomborza in 1872? The correct answer is letter B. They were accused of participating in the Cavite Mutiny. Because the three priests, Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora, were falsely accused of instigating the Cavite Mutiny with a failed uprising by Filipino soldiers, and their execution fueled nationalist sentiments inspiring future revolutionaries. Next, the Treaty of Paris 1898 resulted in which of the following? Correct answer is letter B. The sale of Philippines to the United States for 20 million. Because the treaty ended the Spanish-American War, so with Spain ceding the Philippines to the US in exchange for 20 million. However, Filipinos were not consulted, leading to the Philippine-American War. Next, what was the significance of the cry of Bugad Lawin? The correct answer is letter D. It signaled the beginning of Philippine Revolution against Spain. So this event led to Andres Bonifacio, marked the start of the Philippine Revolution when revolutionaries tore their cedulas or the tax documents in defiance of Spanish rule. Next, who was the main author of the Philippine Declaration of Independence? The correct answer is Emilio Aguinaldo. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo proclaimed Philippine independence in Kawit, Cavite. The declaration was written by Ambrosio Rianzares Bautista, but Aguinaldo played the leading role in the movement. Next, what was the first book ever printed in the Philippines? The correct answer is letter C, Doctrina Christiana. Because it is printed in 1593, and this book was a religious text written in Baybayin and Spanish, used for the Christianization of Filipinos, and No Limitangere and Il Filibusterismo were published later during the 19th century. Next, which ancient script was widely used in the Philippines before Spanish colonization? The correct answer is baybayin. Baybayin was a pre-colonial writing system that is used by early Filipinos, and it was later discouraged by the Spanish colonizers who imposed the Roman alphabet. Next, how did the encomienda system affect Filipino society during Spanish colonization? The correct answer is letter B. It led to forced labor and exploitation of indigenous people. Because Filipinos were forced to work for the Spanish landowners without fair pay. Next, why was the Pact of Biak na Bato signed in 1897? The answer is letter C. To temporarily cease hostilities between the Spaniards and the revolutionaries. So this agreement stopped fighting for a while, but revolutionaries later resumed their fight for independence. Next, why did Jose Rizal write Noli Me Tangere? So the answer is to expose the abuses of the Spanish colonial government and friars. Because Rizal's novel showed the injustices and mistreatment of Filipinos under the Spanish rule. Next, how did the arrival of Ferdinand Magellan in 1521 impact Philippine history? The correct answer is letter A. It marked the beginning of Spanish colonization. So Magellan's arrival led to Spain's conquest of the Philippines, changing the Filipino society and the culture. Next, why was the Katipunan founded by Andres Bonifacio? The answer is letter B. To fight for Philippine independence through armed revolution. Because Bonifacio created the Katipunan to fight against Spain and gain independence. Next, what was the significance of the Malolos Constitution? Answer is letter A. It was the first republican constitution in Asia. This was the first constitution that established a democratic government in the Philippines. Next, if you were a journalist during the Spanish colonial period, how would the propaganda movement influence your writing? The answer is letter A. You would write about the benefits of Spanish rule. Because the propaganda movement aimed to change the Spanish government's unfair treatment of Filipinos. Next, a town mayor in the late 18th is applying the Maura law. What reform does this law emphasize? The answer is letter A. The establishment of local town governance. So the Maura law allowed the towns to have some self-rule instead of being fully controlled by Spain. Next, if you are a Filipino living under the Spanish encomienda system, how would this system affect your daily life? The answer is letter A. You would be required to pay tribute and provide labor because Filipinos had to give taxes and free labor to Spanish officials and friars. Next, suppose you were a revolutionary leader in 1896. Based on historical events, what strategy would you adopt to fight against Spain? The answer is letter A, establishing an underground resistance movement. So Katipunan secretly organized and gathered weapons before openly fighting Spain. Next, if the Katipunan had been discovered earlier than 1896, what would have likely happened? The answer is letter C. The revolution might have been crushed before gaining support. Because if Spain had known about the Katipunan too early, they might have stopped it before Filipinos could unite. Next, if you were Apolinario Mabini, how would you justify your opposition to US rule? The answer is letter C, by arguing that the Philippines was ready for self-governance. Because Mabini believed that Filipinos could govern themselves without foreign rule. Next, if you were a member of the Malolos Congress, what would be your priority in drafting the Philippine Constitution? The answer is letter B, establishing a democratic government. Because the Malolos Constitution created the first democratic government in Asia. Next, if you were tasked with organizing a resistance during World War II, what would be your primary strategy? The answer is letter B, engaging in guerrilla warfare against Japanese forces. Because Filipino guerrilla fighters used surprise attacks against the stronger Japanese army. Next, a modern historian is studying pre-colonial Philippines. Which aspect of society would most challenge the idea that Filipinos were uncivilized and before Spanish rule? So the answer is letter D, the presence of organized barangay governments. Because Filipinos already had organized communities, laws, and leaders before the Spain arrived. Next, if you were a delegate in the 1935 Constitutional Convention, what would be a major issue you'd debate? The answer is letter A, the role of the US in the Philippine governance. Because in 1935, the Philippines preparing for independence, but the US still had power over the country. Next, how would the divide and rule policy of the Spanish affect Filipino unity? The answer is letter D. It would encourage rivalry among different ethnic groups. Because Spain made Filipinos fight each other to keep them from uniting against colonization. If you were a teacher during the American period, how would your curriculum change under the new government? The answer is letter A. You would be required to teach English as the primary language because the Americas introduced English in schools to replace Spanish. Next, if Emilio Aguinaldo had refused exile in Hong Kong, what might have been the immediate consequence? The answer is letter A. The Spanish would have continued fighting the revolutionaries because Spain allowed Aguinaldo to go into into exile so they could have temporarily stopped the revolution. Next, compare the leadership styles of Andres Bonifacio and Emilio Aguinaldo. Which statement is most accurate? The answer is letter B. Bonifacio led through revolutionary ideals, while Aguinaldo favored strategic alliances. Because Andres Bonifacio was a passionate revolutionary who believed that Filipinos had to fight immediately for independence using the Katipunan's armed forces. Meanwhile, Emilio Aguinaldo was more tactical. He was open to negotiating agreements and forming alliances, such as his temporary truce with the Spaniards in the Pact of Biak na Bato. While Bonifacio pushed for direct action, Aguinaldo used a mix of diplomacy and military strategy to gain independence. Next, what was the impact of the Philippine-American War on the newly established First Philippine Republic? The answer is letter B. It led to the eventual defeat and capture of Aguinaldo. Because after declaring the independence, Filipinos fought against the U.S. in the Philippine-American War, that is 1899 to 1802, to maintain their sovereignty. However, the American military was stronger, and their superior weapons and strategies led to the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901. So his arrest marked the end of the First Philippine Republic, forcing the Filipinos to accept the U.S. rule. Next, how did the execution of Jose Rizal influence the Philippine Revolution? Answer is letter D. It ignited stronger nationalist sentiments among Filipinos. Because Jose Rizal advocated for peaceful reforms, but when the Spanish executed him on December 30, 1896, Filipinos realized that Spain would never allow fair treatment. So his death became a rallying cry, convincing more Filipinos to join the revolution. Leaders like Andres Bonifacio and Emilio Aguinaldo used Rizal's martyrdom to inspire their fighters. Next, how did the Battle of Manila Bay in 1898 shape the future of the Philippines? The answer is letter B. It resulted in the U.S. taking over the Philippines from Spain. Because in the Battle of Manila Bay, the American Navy led by Commodore George Dewey, quickly defeated the Spanish fleet. So this battle was significant because it ended Spanish rule in the Philippines. However, instead of granting Filipinos independence, the U.S. took control, leading to another war, which is the Philippine-American War. Next, what was one major reason why the Philippine-American War lasted longer than expected? The answer is letter A. Filipino guerrilla tactics made it difficult for the US to win quickly. Filipinos used guerrilla warfare, meaning they fought in small surprise attacks instead of facing the Americans in direct battles. So this strategy made it harder for the US military to defeat them, prolonging the war. So the terrain of the Philippines, with its mountains and forests, also helped Filipino fighters to avoid capture. Next, how did the encomienda system contribute Filipino resistance against Spanish rule? The answer is letter D. It forced many Filipinos into labor, leading to discontent and uprisings. Because the encomienda system was a Spanish policy where Filipinos had to work for Spanish landowners and pay taxes. So this system was abusive, and as many Filipinos were forced into unfair labor, because of this, many uprisings occurred, such as the Daguhoy Rebellion in Bohol and Diego Sirlang's revolt in Ilocos. Next, how did American policies in the early 19th affect the Philippine independence movement? The answer is letter A. They introduced gradual political reforms while delaying full independence. Because the US gave Filipinos more rights over time, such as allowing them to elect their own leaders through the Jones Law, that is 1916. However, full independence was still delayed because the US wanted to train Filipinos for self-rule but to still keep control over the country for economic and military reasons. Next, what was the impact of the Pact of Biak na Bato on the Philippine Revolution? The answer is letter A. It temporarily halted the revolution, but fighting resumed later. Because this agreement in 1897 was signed between Aguinaldo and Spain, where the revolutionaries agreed to stop fighting in exchange for money and exile. However, when Spain failed to fulfill its promises, Aguinaldo returned and continued the revolution. Next, how did the World War II change the political landscape of the Philippines? The answer is letter A. It accelerated the movement toward Philippine independence because after the war, the US realized that the Philippines had suffered too much under the Japanese occupation. So, seeing Filipinos' bravery and resistance, the US finally granted full independence on July 4, 1946. Next, evaluate the effects of martial law in the Philippines, 1972 to 1981. What was one of its major consequences? The answer is letter C. Suppression of opposition and increased government control. Because under Ferdinand Marcos' martial law, many political opponents, activists, and journalists were arrested, silenced, and disappeared. The government controlled the media, businesses, and the military, limiting freedom of speech and human rights. While Marcos claimed the martial law was for economic progress and national security, it was mostly used to maintain his power. Next, assess the impact of the Philippine Revolution of 1896. So, what was its most significant achievement? The answer is letter B. It awakened Filipino nationalism and inspired future independence movements. The Philippine because the Philippine Revolution against Spain started in 1896 and showed that Filipinos were willing to fight for freedom. Even though Spain was eventually replaced by the US as a colonial ruler, the revolution laid the foundation for future independence efforts. Next, considering the objectives of the propaganda movement, how effective was it in achieving reforms? The answer is letter D. It had limited success but contributed to the rise of nationalism. Because the propaganda movement tried to gain equal rights for Filipinos through peaceful reforms, but Spain mostly ignored their demands. However, the writings influenced the Philippine Revolution, making Filipinos more aware of their rights. Next, how did the Treaty of Paris 1898 shape the future of the Philippines? Answer is letter D. It transferred control from Spain to the United States, leading to another period of colonial rule. Because the treaty did not grant Filipinos independence, instead, the US became the new colonial power, forcing the Filipinos to fight another war for freedom. Evaluate the role of Jose Rizal in the fight for Philippines independence. What was his greatest contribution? The answer is letter D. The answer is letter B. He wrote novels and essays that inspired Filipino nationalism. Because Rizal uses writings like Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo to expose Spanish abuses, so his works inspired revolutionaries like Bonifacio and Aguinaldo to take action. Next, how did the governance Next, how did the 1935 Constitution impact Philippine governance? The correct answer is letter A. It paved the way for independence and established a democratic system. Because the 1935 Constitution allowed Filipinos to have their own president, vice president, and Congress, preparing them for full independence from the US. Next, which symbol best represents the struggles and triumphs of the Philippine revolutionaries? The answer is letter A bolo knife, representing the revolutionaries' fight for independence. Because the bolo knife was a weapon used by Filipino revolutionaries during the Philippine Revolution and the Philippine-American War. So it symbolizes the bravery of Filipinos who fought for independence despite limited weapons. Next, what historical name was used by Chinese traders to refer to the Philippines before Spanish colonization? The answer is letter D, Maay. Ancient Chinese traders called the Philippines Maay as recorded in early Chinese texts. This shows that even before the Spanish colonization, the, the Philippines had trade relations with China. Next, what statement should have been added to the Philippine Declaration of Independence to strengthen its impact? The answer is letter A rejection of future foreign intervention in Philippine affairs. Because although Emilio Aguinaldo declared independence in 1898, the US the Philippines was later controlled by the US. If the declaration had strongly rejected all foreign control. So it might have influenced international recognition of Philippine independence. Next, who was known as the brains of the revolution? The answer is letter C, Apolinario Mabini. Mabini was a key advisor to Aguinaldo and played a significant role in forming the Malolos Constitution. His intellectual contribution earned him this title. Next, what significant event happened on June 12, 1898? The answer is letter B, the proclamation of Philippine independence. On this date, Aguinaldo declared independence from Spain in Cavite, symbolizing the birth of the Philippine nation. Next, who was the first Filipino to circumnavigate the world? The answer is letter D, Enrique of Malacca. Enrique, Magellan's Malay slave and interpreter, is believed to have completed a full circumnavigation after Magellan's death. Next, what was the main purpose of the Spanish galleon trade? The answer is letter B, to establish direct trade between the Philippines and Mexico. The galleon trade connected to the Philippines and Mexico, allowing goods to be transported between Asia and the Americas. Next, the Code of Calantiao was once believed to be an ancient legal code. What is known about it? The answer is letter A. It was actually a hoax. Because historians found that the Code of Calantiao was fake and not real part of the Philippine history. Next, what was the first city established by the Spaniards in the Philippines? The answer is letter B, Cebu. Cebu was the first Spanish settlement in the Philippines established by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. Next, which Philippine hero wrote La Solidaridad articles under the pen name Plaridel? The answer is letter A, Marcelo H. del Pilar. Marcelo H. del Pilar wrote articles to fight for Filipino rights during the Spanish period. Next, Next, who was the only who was the only Philippine president to hold office during the Japanese occupation? So the answer is letter D, Jose P. Laurel. Because the Japanese appointed Jose P. Laurel as the president of the puppet government during the World War II. Next, why was the Treaty of Paris 1898 controversial for Filipinos? Because it is officially ended Spanish rule but transferred control to the United States. So the answer is letter A. Because the treaty allowed the US to take control of the Philippines even though Filipino wanted a independence. Next, how did the Cavite Mutiny of 1872 contribute to the Philippine Revolution? The answer is letter A. It led to the execution of Gomborza, inspiring future revolutionaries. The execution of the Gomborza was made Filipinos realize they needed to fight for their rights. Next, how did why did Emilio Aguinaldo agree to go into exile in Hong Kong in 1897? The answer is letter D. As a part of Biak na Bato Agreement in exchange for financial compensation. Spain paid Aguinaldo to stop the revolution, but he later returned to continue the fight. What was the role of the Ilustrados in the Philippine Revolution? The answer is letter B. They were educated Filipinos who advocate for peaceful reforms. Ilustrados, or the educated Filipinos, wanted reforms through peaceful means instead of wars. Next, how did the United States how did the United States justify taking control of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War? The answer is letter A. They claim it was their duty to civilize and educate Filipinos. But the US said that they were helping Filipinos, but in reality, they ruled the country as a colony. Next, what was the impact of the Jones Law of 1916 on Philippine governance? The answer is letter D. It granted Filipinos more autonomy and a promise of future independence. Because the Jones Law gave Filipinos some control over their government, and promised independence in the future. Next, if the Commonwealth government had not been established in 1935, how would that have affected Philippine independence? The answer is letter A. Independence would have been delayed or uncertain because the Commonwealth was a transition government before the Philippines became fully independent. Next, if you were a leader of the propaganda movement, which reform would you prioritize? The answer is letter B. Equal rights for Filipinos and Spaniards, because the propaganda movement fought for equal treatment of Filipinos under the Spanish law. Next, if the Spanish had successfully repressed the propaganda movement, What might have happened to the Philippine nationalism? The answer is letter C. It would have developed more slowly because without the propaganda movement, fewer Filipinos might have fought for independence. If you were a Filipino soldier during the Philippine American War, what challenges would you face? The answer is letter D. Limited weapons and supplies compared to American forces, because the US had better weapons while Filipino soldiers had few resources. Next, if the Japanese occupation had lasted longer, what would be a major consequence of the Philippines? The answer is letter A. Greater economic hardship and loss of Filipino cultural identity. Because the Japanese controlled businesses, food, and education, making life harder for Filipinos. Next, if the Hukbalahap rebellion had succeeded, how would the Philippine government have changed? The answer is letter B. It might have adopted a socialist or communist system, because the Hukbalahap was a communist movement fighting for land reforms. Next, if you were a part of the 1898 revolution, why might you hesitate to accept American support? The answer is letter A. The US might have its own colonial interests, because the US helped Filipinos fight Spain, but later took control of the Philippines. Next, if the First Philippine Republic had survived longer, how might Philippine politics have evolved? The answer is letter A. A stronger democratic government would have developed earlier, because if Aguinaldo's government lasted, the Philippines could have earlier independence. Next, if you were a historian analyzing the execution of Gomborza, what conclusion would you most likely reach? The answer is letter A. Their execution fueled Filipino nationalism, because many Filipinos became more determined to fight for independence after Gomborza was executed. Next, if Spain had not colonized the Philippines, what might be a major difference in Filipino culture today? The answer is letter D. The country might have retained indigenous belief and scripts, because without Spanish influence, Filipinos might still use baybayin and practice the native religions. Next, if the Philippines have been granted immediate independence in 1898, what challenge would it have faced? The answer is letter B. Political instability due to the lack of experience in self-governance. Because after Spain was defeated, the Philippines declared independence on June 12, 1898. However, the country had little experience in self-rule, and different leaders had conflicting ideas on how to govern. And Emilio Aguinaldo's government was still forming, and there was no clear structure for managing the entire archipelago. If the US had not taken control, the Philippines would have struggled to create a strong government, leading to the possible civil wars among different factions. Next, if the Americans had not introduced the public school system in the Philippines, what would be likely What would be a likely outcome? The answer is letter C. The education would have remained exclusive to the elite. Before the Americans came, the Spanish education system in the Philippines was mostly controlled by the Catholic Church. Schools were limited and only the wealthy Filipinos or the ilustrados could afford to study. So when the Americans took over, they introduced a free public education, making it possible for more Filipinos to go to school. Without this change, only the rich would have continued to receive formal education and literacy rates would have remained low. Next, if the Jones Law of 1916 had not been passed, how would Philippine governance have been affected? The answer is letter A. Filipinos would have had less political autonomy under American rule. Because the Jones Law was a key step toward the Philippine independence because it allowed Filipinos to elect their own representative in the legislature. And without it, Americans would have continued to dominate the government, making Filipinos feel like they had no control over their own country. So the promise of future independence might have also been delayed or completely removed, and keeping the Philippines under longer US colonial rule. Next, fewer of Filipino nationalists in the 19th century. Which strategy would you most likely use to push for reforms? So the answer is letter A. Writing articles and essays to expose the Spanish abuses. The propaganda movement, led by Filipino intellectuals like Jose Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, and Garciano Lopez Haina, used newspapers, essays, and books to expose the abuses of Spanish officials and friars. So since the Spanish government strictly controlled military and political actions, using words and ideas was the safest and most effective way to inspire change without immediately resorting the war. So that this strategy later led to the rise of the Katipunan and the Philippine Revolution. Next, Next, how did the Japanese occupation impact Filipino nationalism? So the answer is letter A. It strengthened the desire for independence and self-rule. Because during the World War II, 1941 and 1945, the Japanese occupied the Philippines and imposed harsh military rule. Filipinos experienced extreme hardships, including forced labor, shortage, and violence. And many Filipinos resisted through underground movements and guerrilla warfare, determined to reclaim their country. So these struggles reinforced the desire for independence, making Filipinos more united in their fight for self-governance after the war. Next, how did the failure of the Spanish government to implement reforms contribute to the Philippine Revolution? The answer is letter C. It fueled anger and resentment, leading Filipinos to take arms. The propaganda movement called reforms such as equal treatment, representation in the Spanish government, and the end of friar abuses. However, Spain ignored these demands and instead punished reformers like Jose Rizal and Marcelo H. del Pilar So this made many Filipinos realize that peaceful reform were impossible, pushing them to support the armed revolution led by Andres Bonifacio and the Katipunan. Next, how did the arrival of Christianity affect pre-colonial Filipino beliefs? The answer is letter D. It led to the widespread conversion of Filipinos and the decline of indigenous religions. Because before the Spain arrived, Filipinos practiced animism, worshipping nature spirits and ancestors. So when the Spanish friars introduced Christianity, many Filipinos converted and indigenous beliefs started to fade. However, some traditional practices were blended with Catholicism, leading to the unique religious culture we have today. Next, what was the main effect of the Jones Law on the Philippines? The answer is letter A. It provided Filipinos with greater self-government but delayed full independence. Because the Jones Law of 1916 created the Philippine legislature, allowing Filipinos to make their own laws for the first time. However, the US still had the control over the major government positions, meaning the true independence was delayed, and the law was a stepping stone toward a self-rule. But Filipinos had to wait until 1946 for the full independence. Next, how did the Philippine participation in the galleon trade affect the economy? The answer is letter B. It linked the Philippines to global commerce but limited local industries. Because the galleon trade 1565 to 1815 connected to the Philippines to Mexico and Spain, allowing products like spices, silk, and gold to be exported. However, the trade focused only on foreign goods, preventing Filipinos from developing local industries like farming and manufacturing. So this dependence on imports made it harder for the country to have a strong self-sustaining economy. Next, what was the most significant political effect of the 1935 Constitution? The answer is letter B. It established the Commonwealth government and prepared the Philippines for independence. The 1935 Constitution was created under rule to help Filipinos transition toward self-government. It established the Commonwealth government led by Manuel L. Quezon and set a 10-year plan for independence. And this was a major step toward the full sovereignty which was achieved in 1946. Next, why was the execution of Gomborza considered a turning point in the Philippine history? The answer is letter A. It inspired the rise of Filipino nationalism and push for reforms. Because the three priests, Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora, were executed in 1872 after being falsely accused of being involved in the Cavite Mutiny. Their deaths angered many Filipinos, making them more aware of Spanish injustices. So Rizal was deeply affected by this event and dedicated his novel El Filibusterismo to Gomborza. So their execution helped spark revolutionary ideas among Filipinos. Next, how did the Treaty of Paris 1898 affect the Philippine struggle for independence? The answer is letter A. It transferred control of the Philippines from Spain to the US, leading to a new phase of resistance. Because the treaty ended the Spanish-American War, but instead of giving independence to Filipinos, Spain sold the Philippines to the US for 20 million, and this betrayal led to the Philippine-American War, as Filipinos refused to be ruled by another foreign power. Next, how did the guerrilla warfare tactics used by Filipinos in World War II impact the fight against Japan? The answer is letter A. It made it difficult for Japanese forces to maintain control over the country because Filipino guerrilla fighters use hit and run tactics, hiding in the forests and mountains to attack the Japanese forces. These tactics made it hard for Japan to maintain full control over the Philippines, allowing Filipino and American forces to eventually reclaim the country. Assess the impact of the Japanese occupation 1941 to 1945 of Philippine society. What was one of its lasting effects? The answer is letter C. It strengthened Filipino nationalism and the push for independence. So the hardships under Japanese rule made Filipinos even more determined to be fully independent after the war. Next, assess the impact of the Japanese occupation, that is 1941 to 1945, on the Philippine society. What was one of its lasting effects? The answer is letter C. It, it strengthened Filipino nationalism and the push for independence. Because the hardships under Japanese rule made Filipinos even more determined to be fully independent after the war. Looking at the results of the EDSA People Power Revolution, that is 1986, what was its most significant outcome? The answer is letter C. The reinstatement of the democratic government and the end of dictatorship. The EDSA People Power Revolution was a peaceful uprising that led to the downfall of Ferdinand Marcos, who had ruled under the martial law for many years. Millions of Filipinos gathered in EDSA Epifanio de los Santos Avenue in February 1986 to protest against the dictatorship. This movement forced Marcos to flee to Hawaii and restore democracy under Corazon Aquino. Corazon Aquino, the first female president of the Philippines, it is one of the world's most successful peaceful revolutions. Next, how did the Bail Trade Act of 1946 affect the post-war Philippine economy? Answer is letter B. It tied the Philippine economy to American interests limiting economic sovereignty. Because after the World War II, the US passed the Bail Trade-off Act, which gave the Philippines financial aid for reconstruction but also forced the country to, to allow American businesses and to have the same right as Filipinos. So this limited the Philippines' ability to control its own economy and made it dependent on the US for the trade and investments. Next, assess the long-term impact of the Hukbalahap movement in the Philippine history. What was one of its lasting effects? The answer is letter A. It contributed to land reform discussions and peasant movements. The Hukbalahap or Hukbong Bayan Laban sa Hapon was originally a guerrilla group that fought the Japanese during the World War II. But after the war, it became a communist rebellion demanding better conditions for farmers and peasants. Although the government suppressed the movement, their calls for land reform led to the future policies aimed at improving farmers' rights. Next, considering the consequences of the Philippine-American War, that is 1899 to 1902, what was its most significant impact? The answer is letter A. It delayed Philippine independence and established the US colonial rule because after the Spain sold the Philippines to the US in the Treaty of Paris, Filipino resisted US rule, leading to the Philippine-American War. So the US defeated Filipino forces and established colonial control, delaying the Philippine independence until 1946. So the war resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. Next, how did the 1987 Constitution address the issues created during the martial law era? The answer is letter A. It restored democratic institutions and protected civil liberties. Because the 1987 Constitution, created after the EDSA Revolution, ensured that freedom of speech and elections were protected. So it is also limited the powers of the president to prevent other dictatorship. Next, how would Philippine governance have been different in the 1896 Philippine Revolution succeeded without the US involvement? The answer is letter B. The first Philippine Republic would have lasted longer without American interference. Because if the Philippine Revolution had been completely successful in removing Spain without US involvement, Aguinaldo's government could have a better chance of survival. Instead, the US took over and defeated Filipino forces in the Philippine-American War, ending the First Philippine Republic in 1901. Next, which historical event deserves a new national historical marker for its significance in Filipino resistance? The answer is letter A. The Labanan sa Bangkusay, 1571, the last stand of native warriors against Spanish forces. The Battle of Bangkusay was a major but less known event where native warriors led by Raja Sulaiman fought against Spanish forces. So this was one of the last major attempts by native Filipinos to resist Spanish colonization. Next, which historical event would be the most dramatic and impactful as the central scene in a play about Philippine history? The answer is letter C. The Battle of Tirad Pass, featuring Gregorio del Pilar's heroic last stand. The Battle of Tirad Pass was a dramatic moment where General Gregorio del Pilar, only at 24 years old, led a small group of soldiers to delay American forces so that Emilio Aguinaldo could escape. Del Pilar and his men fought bravely but were eventually killed. So his sacrifice made him a symbol of patriotism and heroism in the Philippine history. So as I conclude our review of Philippine history, we are reminded of the resilience, bravery, and determination of our ancestors. From pre-colonial times to our struggles for independence, from the revolutions we fought to the challenges we overcame. Each event has shaped the nation we live in today. And understanding history is not just about memorizing dates and names, it is about appreciating the sacrifices of those who came before us and learning their experiences. The lessons of the past serves as a guide for the present and the future, teaching us the value of patriotism, unity, and the continuous pursuit of progress. May this knowledge inspire us to become responsible citizens who uphold the principles of freedom, justice, and democracy. And as we move forward, let us carry with us the spirit of our heroes and contribute to building a better Philippines. That would be all. Thank you.